first step in the formulation of hypothesis is to define the variables that directly or indirectly affect the subject matter of the researcher. The hypothesis test ultimately determines whether the hypothesis is true or false. The third step in hypothesis formulation is to identify the kind of relationship exists between the variable. Hello everyone, I am Harshita, lecturer, Department of Commerce, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. My dear students, today we are in the 7th session of Unit 4 and the Unit 4 of Business Research Methods is Sampling and Hypothesis Testing. So already we have discussed few of the concepts. So completely we have learnt about sampling. So next we have come to the concept of hypothesis, and in a previous session we have discussed few concepts relating to hypothesis. So let us quickly recall here. So in our previous session I have covered this topic, that is we have learnt about meaning of hypothesis. Now what do you mean by hypothesis? Before the research work is being conducted, if the researcher selects a particular topic, so what would be the end result? So he will assume in advance. So that is known as what? Hypothesis. That is the assumption which is made by the researcher before conducting the research work or before getting the ultimate result of research. So he will assume certain things about the ultimate result. That is known as what? Hypothesis. Next, we have learnt about characteristics of hypothesis. So, what are the various characteristics of hypothesis? Next, sources of hypothesis. So, how a researcher can assume certain things or assume the end result of the research work. So, on the basis of what? So, that we have learnt under sources of hypothesis. In today's session, we shall continue with a new concept, that is formulation of hypothesis. So, how the hypothesis has to be formed. So, hypothesis plays a vital role while conducting a research. So, of course, for each and every research work, the duty of an researcher is to create a hypothesis. That is, make some assumptions based on his knowledge or based on his experience or based on the previous study. He can assume certain things about the end result of his research work. So, it plays a vital role because it acts as a direction. It shows the direction for the researcher in what way he has to go and what are the results he has to obtain from his research work. So, here this hypothesis acts as a direction for the researcher. So, it is a proposition that the researcher wants to prove in his research studies. Now, what is an hypothesis? What he wanted to prove in the future. So, what are his presumption? So, what is the end result of his research work? And that things what he has to prove at the end of his research work. So, that will be done through formulation of hypothesis. So, researchers may formulate hypothesis either on the basis of some previous studies. So, yesterday we have discussed on the basis of what hypothesis can be created. So, hypothesis can be created on the basis of own experience of the researcher or from his previous study or through observation also he can create the hypothesis. So, how the hypothesis can be formulated? It can be formulated through previous studies or on the basis of certain influencing factors. So, we have discussed those influencing factors in a previous session. That is, as I have told you, hypothesis can be created by the researcher in the form of observation. So, whatever he is going to observe, on the basis of that, he can make the judgment or he can make the assumptions. And on the basis of previous study or by seeing the work of some other person, some other researcher. So, on the basis of that also, he can make the assumptions. So, this is how he is going to formulate the hypothesis. Next, the hypothesis test ultimately determines whether the hypothesis is true or false. So, this is a main thing. So, as I have told you, hypothesis will be created by the researcher before he starts his research work. So, based on his knowledge, based on his experience, he will create some hypothesis. Now, after doing his research work, whatever the hypothesis he has created before, so it has to be tested. So whether the assumptions which is made by the researcher before the research work is correct or not. That is, before he makes the assumptions, then he collects the information, then he'll get the exact result. So exact result as well as the assumptions or the hypothesis what he has created, both has to be tested. So whether it holds good or not, or whether the hypothesis which is created by the researcher is true or false. Hypothesis basically consists of three elements. They include the following. First one is variables. Of course, it is a main duty of the researcher to identify the variables. That is, variables plays a very important role. Next, population or universe. From where he is going to collect the information. Whether he has to collect the information from the whole population through census method or by selecting a group of people from the selected population, which is known as what? Sample. Now, whether he has to collect the information from the population or from the sample. So, that also comes under formulation of hypothesis. Next, relationship between the variables. So, what is the relationship? Of course, he has identified the variable. Now, he has to know what is a relationship, which is a dependent variable or which is independent variable. So, what is the relationship between these two variables? He has to identify carefully. Next, examples for hypothesis. So, let us see few of the examples here. Vehicles sale increases when bank lending increases. So, here this is just an assumption of the researcher here. So, he tells that if the bank lends more money or bank lends more financial assistance to the buyer, then vehicle sale increases. In the sense, he is going to purchase the vehicle or he is going to buy the vehicle. If the financial assistance from the financial institution increases, thereby it leads to increase in the sales volume of the vehicle. So, this is just an assumption which is made by the researcher. Next assumption is that bank lending has no effect on vehicle sales. Now, other assumption is that, so even though if the bank lend or not, but the sales volume of the vehicle will always be high. So, it's not that only the bank loan will influence the increase in sales in volume of the vehicle. So, here there are two assumptions. One tells that, so if the financial assistance which is given by the bank or bank loan which is been provided, so that thereby increases the increase in the sales volume of the vehicle. So, it has a positive effect here. But other assumptions tells that there is no such effect, even though there are certain other sources also. So, there are buyers who has their own money, they need not buy from the financial or they need not borrow from the financial institutions. So, here if the bank lending increases, it does not influence on the increase in the sales volume of the vehicle. So, these are the two assumptions which is made, which is known as what? Hypothesis. Hope you are clear with the formulation of hypothesis. So, what you have to remember here? So, hypothesis can be created on the basis of experience or by previous study or by observation. So, hypothesis is done before the research work is been conducted, where the researcher will create some hypothesis or he will assume certain things about his study. So, after collecting the information, what the end result we will get in the research work, we are going to compare that. That is, whatever the assumptions which is made before the research work and the result what we get after conducting the research work, we are going to test that whether it is true or false. So, assumptions can be made any of the form based on the knowledge of the researcher. So, this is about formulation of hypothesis. Now, coming to the next concept, steps involved in hypothesis formulation. Of course, it is very essential that a researcher has to formulate the hypothesis. Now, let us see what are the steps which are involved in formulation of hypothesis. So, the first one is hypothesis formulation is governed by various factors. So, let us see what are those factors. So, it is influenced by various factors and it involves various steps also. Generally, the following steps are involved while forming the hypothesis. Now, it's not just that they have to follow the same steps here. So, it depends upon the researcher, it depends upon his research work that he can follow any of the steps, that is in order to formulate the hypothesis. But generally, these steps are used in formulation of hypothesis. So, let us see how a researcher will formulate the hypothesis. So, the first one is defining the variables. So, we shall discuss each and every point in detail. So, time being you remember, so these are the steps involved. So, defining the variable. Next one is studying the variables in detail. So, first step is defining the variable. So, he is going to just define the variable. Next, studying those variables in detail. And the next one is explaining the nature of relationship between the variables. So, he has defined the variable, he has studied the variables in detail. Next, he has to explain what is the relationship between the variables. And the fourth one is identifying the population under study. I have told you he can collect the information from many number of individuals, that is more number of respondents, or from a small group of respondents through sampling method. So, here he has to identify the population which is involved under study. Next one is ensuring that variables can be testable. So, I have told you it's not just that creating the hypothesis. At the end of the research work, it should be in such a way that it should be able to test. In the sense, it should be able to compare the hypothesis which is created before the research work and the end result what the researcher will get after the research work. So, both has to be tested. So, we have to check that whatever the assumptions which is made by the researcher is true or false. So, whether it will match with the end result or not. So, these are the few steps here. So, let us discuss one by one in detail. So, coming to the first one, defining the variables. So, the first step which is involved in formulation of hypothesis is to define the variables. So, the first step in the formulation of hypothesis is to define the variables that directly or indirectly affect the subject matter of the researcher. Now, the researcher have selected a topic. Now, we have to define that variable. So, we have to identify the variable which directly or indirectly involved in the research work. So, that is your first step. So, it may be directly or indirectly involved. So, those variables have to be defined properly. The subject matter of the research study should be clearly defined. So, as we know, the subject matter of the research study has to be clearly defined. So, once the problem is being identified, so half of the research work is solved, correct? So, here we have to identify the exact problem of the research study. So, here there is a question, which factors will affect the study and what is to be studied. So, first the researcher has to know which factors will affect the study. So, which factors will affect the study on his particular topic and what is to be studied. So, this he has to identify in the first stage of creating the hypothesis. For example, bank loan increases the car sales. So, this is the assumption. If this is the subject of the research study, then the researcher should clearly define the subject. So, he should clearly define the subject, then he should find whether it is possible to identify the effect of loans on sale of cars. Now, he has to define the variables, correct? Now, this is the study of the researcher, that is bank loan increases the car sales. So, he is telling that increase in bank loan, that is increase in providing bank loan will increase the car sales. So, this is your topic. So, here he has to study the variables properly. He has to define the variables properly. So, this is your first step which is involved in formulation of hypothesis. Coming to the second one, studying the variable in depth. That is, you have defined the variable, now you have to study those variables in detail. So, if we consider bank loans and car sales are the variable. Now, which are the two variables in this topic? that is bank loan, other one is car sales are the variables of the researcher. Then the researcher should conduct an intensive study to understand the effect of bank loan on car sales. Now, he has to study each and every variables in detail. So, now here there are two variables, one is bank loan, other one is car sales. Now, it is a duty of the researcher to identify the variable. So, already he has identified. Now, he has to study the variables in detail and see what is the effect of bank loan on car sales, whether there is any effect. So, whether bank loan will affect the car sales in his study. So, that he has to study in detail. So, extended credit facilities and improved services will drive sales. Of course, we know extended credit facilities. So, if he has lot of credit facilities, then improved services which is provided, so thereby it increases the car sales. In order to prove this statement, the researcher should conduct an elaborate study of variable. So, it's not just that he can't give the assumption by his own, he has to study each and every variables which are involved in that research work in detail. So, he should classify the variables into dependent as well as independent variable. Now, this is a stage where he is going to divide the variables into dependent as well as independent variable to understand the impact as well as incidence aspect. So, here in the second stage, he will divide the variables. So, he will decide which is a dependent variable and which is a independent variable. Now, coming to the third step, specifying the nature of relationship. So, let us see. So, he has defined the variable, he has studied the variables in detail. Now, he has to specify the nature of relationship between the dependent as well as independent variable. The third step in hypothesis formulation is to identify the kind of relationship exists between the variables. So, what is the relationship between the dependent as well as independent variable? Which variable influence the other is important to the researcher. So, which are the variables that influence the other variables? So, what is their relationship between them? So, that has to be studied here. So, which variable influence the other is important to the researcher. That means he should understand which is the independent variable. So, which variable influence more the other variable, that is known as what? Independent variable. So, if the bank loan is a principal variable, then it is treated as independent variable. Now, bank loan, we shall take bank loan as a principal variable, then bank loan is a independent variable because it influences the other variable. Then the sale of cars is identified as dependent variable. Now, independent variable is bank loan and dependent variable is sale of car, because sale of car depends on the extent of bank loan. Of course, in this study, so here sale of car depends upon the availability of bank loan. So, bank loan is an independent variable and sale of car is a dependent variable because sale of car depends upon the availability of bank loan. Increased bank loan will boost the sale of cars. So, if there is more increase in bank loan, so it will boost the sale of car, or it also increases the sale of cars. On the other hand, decreased bank loan will reduce the sale of car. So, if there is decrease in bank loan, then it will reduce the sale of car. So, these are all hypotheses. So, these are all assumptions. Okay. Now, coming to the fourth step, identify the population under study. So, here as I told you, the researcher can collect the information from the whole population or from a group of people who is called as what? Sampling. That is through sampling process or sampling method, he can collect the information. The fourth stage of hypothesis formulation is to identify the population or universe under study. So, from whom the researcher wants to collect the information relating to his particular topic, that is bank loan and its effect on sale of cars. Now, this is the topic. Now, whether he has to go through study of whole population or from a small group of people. So for example, if the researcher imagined that only a certain group of people in a city could buy the cards. So not everyone in the city will buy the cards, only certain people who are financially strong or who will be able to get the financial assistance from the bank, so they will only buy the car. Here the people living in a particular city will constitute the population under study. Now if you take the city, that is Bangalore city. So here the researcher assumes that only the city, that is the researcher will take the population under study of only Bangalore city. So he thinks that only the people of Bangalore city will be able to buy the cars, then the whole population, that is the whole Bangalore city, will be the population under study. So this is known as the target market. So this is known as what? Target market, because he is going to target on a particular group of people. So the target group of consumers can be identified by their age, education, qualification, profession, occupation, sex, income level, etc. So there are other number of factors which influence deciding the population. So we have already discussed in a previous unit. So here what you have to remember here, so what the researcher will do while creating an hypothesis or through formulation of an hypothesis, so he has to identify who are the target respondents, who are the population who comes under the study of research. That is your fourth step. Now coming to the fifth one, ensure that variables can be testable. So as I have already told you, researcher has to create the hypothesis in such a way that at the end of the research work, it should be able to test it. So it should be able to test the hypothesis with the ultimate result what the researcher have got. So there should be a comparison. So that or the hypothesis has to be created in such a way that at the end of the research work, it should be tested. So the variables of hypothesis can be testable, otherwise the research study has no meaning. So of course, so if the hypothesis is not able to be tested at the end of the research work, then there is no meaning of creating the hypothesis, as well as no meaning in creating the or no meaning in conducting the research also. So it should be tested. So the research study should either accept or reject variables. So as I've told you, while testing the hypothesis, we will come to know whether it has to be accepted or rejected. Therefore, the selected variable, so the researcher has to be very careful while selecting the variable, that is both dependent as well as independent variable. Therefore, the selected variables, if they are testable, then only the researcher should accept the variable. So only if it is in a position to be tested, then only the researcher can accept the variable, or otherwise he should reject the variables. So other option is that, so it should be, or what you have to remember here, the variables what the researcher is going to identify in the hypothesis, it should be able to, or it should be in such a way that it should be tested at the end of the research work. So if the variables are not in a position to be tested, then those variables has to be rejected. So these are the few steps which are involved in hypothesis formulation. So in my next session, I am going to continue the last concept on hypothesis, that is types of hypothesis, and the next one is errors in hypothesis testing. So what are the errors which are involved in hypothesis testing? So we have already learnt about sampling error. So we shall learn about hypothesis error and two-tailed as well as one-tailed test of hypothesis. So these are the few concepts what I am going to discuss in my next session. So my dear students, hope you have understood today's session. See you all in my next session with a new topic. Till then, take care. Thank you.